pleasure to be here, and it's had a wonderful time. I've been driving around yesterday and today with Mark Lamster yesterday and also Nate, and seeing Dallas and all the kind of extraordinary parts of it and the unique culture that exists here. Something that was really interesting for me. It's one of the benefits of traveling and lecturing. You learn so much about the U.S. and also cities. So how's this? Is this working okay?
Yes.
Let's get a thumbs up in the back, okay? Okay, good. Well, today I'm gonna, talk about some critical issues that are important to myself and certainly my practice. The driving force between our firm work addresses urban culture. It's something that I'm passionate about. It's something that I've been very committed to from the beginning stages. I have lived my life living in cities. I've always been intrigued about these kind of unique issues that come up. Well, and that is the driving force with all of my work. It's about urban culture. It's about social civic connectivity. How do you create an architecture that is more important than simply the object, but something that really engages in multiple ways? So one of the other issues that we find extremely important with the not only practice, but for me personally, is that we know that cities are going to be growing unprecedentedly over the years, including that we all know within 2050, there should be conceivably close to 70% of the world population will be living in cities. And if you imagine that, how can we manage this intense urban growth? How are we going to be able to accomplish this? How are we going to be able to create significant challenges? And that is one of the great challenges of our time. If one can imagine in 2050 with 70% of the world population living in cities, cities aren't prepared right now. It's something that we have to really address and be very much connected to and embrace. And that's the role we think the role of architecture should be. I do believe that architecture is a social act. It's something that's been important to me and my practice at large. And you need to do a work of consequence. That's equally as important. How do you, as a role of architect, not only produce buildings, but how do you do work of consequence? Something that is relevant, something that's going to engage cities, something that's going to make an impact. So 20, 30, 40 years, when you do a piece of architecture, it has an impact. It also it recognizes and embraces the future as well. Those are the aspects that drive our work. In other words, exceptional architecture can. Okay, how about this? I've got all these bits here. You know what I might do? How's that? I'm going to just hold it. There we go. Thank you very much. It wasn't quite working. So in other words, exceptional architecture can elevate the built environment. This is something that has been close to my heart, close to the work that we do in our practice. It's something that's very important. The type of architecture does not have to be limited to a privileged few. This is something that drives our work. It's something I'm passionate about, and it's something that gives us, and gives myself personally, the commitment every day when I go to work. Today I am going to touch upon our affordable housing projects as well as subsidized housing. These projects are important part of the fabric of the city and can impact communities in a great way. So this is what the nature of the lecture is today. We have done multiple type of projects that are not only cultural, civic, institutional, but today we're going to talk about the housing projects. At LOHR, our goal is to change the stereotype of how people perceive these projects, and by embracing design is equitable, inspiring, and uplifting. That's what drives our work. Within that in mind, I want to begin to introduce you the core values of our work. We harness the complexities of opportunities, and I use the term latent because we think that architecture that addresses those issues, the hidden opportunities, is what drives architecture. It's not simply the ones that you can see clearly, but the ones that are hidden. And that's something that we look for and strive for all of our projects. What are the unexpected moments in a particular project that can help drive your work? And to me, that's something that actually drives good architecture and transforms it. We also believe in this unusual term, ruthless optimism. My wife has used to challenge me on that word, is how can you be optimistic and ruthless at the same time? In one sense, it feels like an oxymoron that they can't work together. I'm convinced they can. I think as an architect, you have to be optimistic, and sometimes you have to be ruthless about that. You have to really believe it, because there are strong parameters, strong forces against you, and you have to be able to do that. If you can find that in optimism, and you can embrace the principles of creative pragmatism, which is the other term that drives our work, that works. How can you recognize the role of architecture, but how do you be creative about that? How do you find ways to solve problems, but also bring another layer of
excellence to the project and really drive it, because architects are visual. We want to be driven by aesthetics, equally so to social, civic, and issues as well, politics included. These are things that drive our work and are very important to us. Equally so, we do believe that exceptional architecture elevates the built environment and radiates beyond its boundaries. When you think of architecture, it's not about simply producing a product. It's not as if a client comes to you and say, here's our parameters, we have a site, we want you to produce this project. We're convinced that the role of the architect as a strategist radiates far beyond a structure's prescribed boundaries. It's something that we think is important, and as architects, we need to be aware of adjacencies. We need to be aware of the sidewalk and the street. How do you create an architecture that engages all that? These are issues that are extremely important to me. So the prescribed boundaries is something that is unique, but at the same time, you have to go well beyond it. So with that in mind, we did create a book. It is called Amplified Urbanism. It was a term I coined. It describes our design philosophy and methodology, which is rooted in the idea of emphasizing civic and social connections, encouraging creative, fluid interaction between public and private spaces. And I want to talk a bit about that. The idea that you can create an architecture that has this public-private realm. Architecture, LA is a very privatized city. A significant amount of work is you come to the edge, you're bound to your property line, and you turn your back to the city. This is something that's been an issue with cities forever. Can you activate that? How can you take your responsibility further and push those ideas? What is that public-private realm? How can you create it? Can you borrow space? Can you create borrowed space from your private land for the public realm? Can you begin that, can you kind of engage that kind of edge? And that's what's critical to us. Equally so, the idea of harnessing ecological and infrastructural patterns. Where is the culture you're working? Where's the context? When I use the term ecological, I'm meaning people, not simply sustainable issues, but people. How do you create an architecture that engages people and recognizes that that's what we're doing? People live and work in architecture, so it's important to recognize that in a very big way. We were very excited about a book we wrote. It was published in January 2017. What we did is we invited a number of authors to present and analyze their ideas, both from cultural, civic, and ecological leaders, with varying insights about city life. And I'm happy to continue that discussion and that dialogue today. This was a very exciting project for us. It was a book that was a research-based book, but it wasn't inviting perhaps other architects or designers to write. It was about going to writers, poets, sculptors, and really engage them and ask them, how do you see the city? One of the writers is a gentleman named David Hewlin, who wrote a book called Sidewalking, and it was experience in Los Angeles from walking on the sidewalks, which is a highly unusual thing in an automotive city. People are always assumed the way to see the city is in your car. But he wrote a whole book about that experience. How do you create the city on sidewalks? What's the engagement? What's the memories you have from that? So it was a very fascinating writer that was included in the book. So today we have actually books here apparently. So, but it's recognizing all these issues. The next issue that we started to look at is, okay, how do we achieve these issues of amplified urbanism? So we implement 3 design strategies: strategic voids, activated edges, and bold or inventive materiality. So within our work, to create a kind of in a sense a DNA of what we do, we really address each project with this issue, whether it's a low-income homeless housing project or a market rate projects. We address all the projects from this same standpoint. And this has been something that's been very essential to our work. For example, this is a museum we're working on in Detroit. It's called the African Bead Museum, and it's a very extraordinary project which was falling apart. It was a project that was given by this artist, Oleani Doubles. His commitment to creating gathering spaces for the community in Detroit to educate them about African culture was extremely important. So we're collaborating with Doubles on this project, and these type of projects are talking about issues, in my opinion, about strategic voids. And so these voids, or these void spaces, or open spaces in buildings, whether it's outside or inside. This is actually a building we actually implanted, so to speak, in this building. The roof on this existing structure had fallen down. It was collapsed, so we cleaned it up, and we're now under construction on this, and this is the solution we're going to be able to produce. So strategic voids create opportunities for social interaction defined by carved out open spaces. So this is about that opportunity. How do you look at it from a different context? And so this is one of the tools that we use. Equally so, we look at ideas of activated edges. And the idea that you can dematerialize the boundaries of a building and let the surrounding community permeate the site and offer opportunities for engagement. So this is a project we're under construction in Los Angeles, and you can see the whole street level, the pedestrian level is essentially cut away, activated by virtue of a number of different moves and gestures. Not only the corners are being eroded away, but we equally so in the middle of the building, we fold things back, we actually fold down the podium down to the street, and these efforts to try to activate that really works well. When you think about downtown Dallas or equally so other cities, they're great buildings, but how do you activate it? How do you create it? How do you create an environment that creates and encourages people to come there? And our argument is if you activate it through program and activate it through architecture, that will suggest a way of enriching and inspired spaces within cities. And this is something we apply for all of our project. Equally so, we look at the idea of unique materials. This is some bus stops we did in the city of Santa Monica. And this was an idea of how do you rethink the convention of bus stops. Bus stops, in a sense, are the hidden infrastructure. They're the small infrastructures that no one ever pays attention to. We think that's an interesting concept. It's an interesting, in a way, challenge. How do you go and tackle a very simple idea of a bus stop and push it further? It's always the one that you don't notice. It's always the unistrut pole with the sign. We're convinced that you can really engage the idea of public components like bus stops in a very unique way. And if you think of the public transit that exists in cities, why not? Why can't you make bus stops? Why can't you make light transit? Very interesting architectural gestures. So this was what we did on this project. We also have done some speculative work. This was an exhibition we did in Los Angeles called Watershed. And Watershed was also looking at issues of amplified urbanism. It was devised as a series of inventive interventions within the city of Los Angeles and primarily the LA River. LA River is this very unusual scenario where you have a concrete bath, so to speak, basin, which projects and directs all the water out to the ocean. LA is designed in such a way that it tries to reject water. It hits your houses or your buildings. It is directed towards the street, into the storm drain system, and out to the LA River and then the ocean. So Los Angeles right now collects 2% of water when it comes. 98% is gone. It is projected, it's actually through the river into the ocean. Our argument is, can you collect it and save it? Can you purify it and can you store it? And possibly use it for storm water, or can you use it for components like irrigation and gray water systems? So our argument is you can do that. You can actually design components and overlay infrastructure on housing, overlay infrastructure on bridges, overlay all these elements, but find ways to capture water, which is an essential thing, and certainly globally right now. It's not only an issue with Los Angeles, but it conceivably is an issue here in Dallas. I know that you also deal with issues of drought. That's always been intriguing to me, to think that Los Angeles is a drought. It doesn't rain for 5 years, and the rain comes, and they only capture 2% of it. Whereas if you can capture it in some manner or some form, it means you can then use it for when you have the other additional 5 years of a drought, which is going to come right after you get the rains. We also use it with regards to galleries, this idea of openness, this idea of transparency, creating these units. Here we are carving out an outdoor space, as you can see in the entry. So that's actually an outdoor, it projects out, that's an open space. We have these sliders that open, so when you come into this gallery, you're actually outside and then you come in. So it's an interesting concept of having landscape inside galleries. This principled idea of outside, inside, this idea of public and private realm is something we push in all of our project. Equally so, another interesting component of structure, the hidden structures. These are billboard structures. Billboard structures are the ones you don't notice. What you notice is the advertisement. So we were approached by the city of West Hollywood to ask us would be interested in designing the structure for billboards. So we thought that was a fascinating opportunity. Now, when we designed this, we call it the wishbone, the blue wishbone billboard. At the time, the clients were a little bit concerned because there's a number of components of it that made the cost on this about 200,000 more than your conventional billboard structure. Billboard structures are about 300,000 to 400,000. This costs about 550,000. So they were quite nervous until Apple approached them and said, "We love the design of the structure. We would like to have a 2-year lease contract with you. We want to give you $40,000 a month if we can use this billboard structure." So my clients loved us. So we are now going to quit architecture and do billboard structures. So that's one way of engaging Apple. So you can see this is Apple. They own Nest. And so for 2 years, this client is making $40,000 a month leasing this for Nest. So it's a very interesting way of design does sell, that if you take that edge, you push it a little bit further, and you create opportunities that is rarely done. Billboard structures are normally this conventional 3-foot diameter tubes, and no one ever experiences, no one really sees it, but you design it unexpectedly, it might bring up these opportunities. So we do think these aspects are extremely important. Equally so, we're doing 2 different studies for the city of Detroit. They've commissioned us to look at a 6 square mile area of northwest Detroit. Detroit is going through this profound transformation. It's something I'm very excited and very honored to be part of. We're doing 10 projects in Detroit right now. And it's something which has been very important to us. We're learning so much working with people in Detroit. The planning commissioners, including this wonderful man, Maurice Cox, who's become a friend and colleague over the years. I know he lectured here a few weeks ago, I believe. Maurice is heading up the planning commissions. He's the head planner. He's looking at this idea of engaging the neighborhoods. Pull away from Detroit, the center, and start to activate the neighborhoods, create architecture in those areas, encouraging architects to come there and engage good developers who want to do that. The city is dealing with the public-private partnerships and saying, look, if we have a developer who wants to produce architecture that for the people who are there, we will sell this land to you at 50% cut. So this relationship of the city working with developers to create architecture that is for people who are there is a really unique approach. This was a school that was derelict on the left-hand side, and we're turning it into a hybrid program of school during the day and vocational school in the evening for adults. It's a way of reutilizing, reformulating these buildings. Schools are gone. Public school in Detroit, they have no money for teachers. Went south. They now have charter schools. It's the primary way of education in Detroit. We think we can bring back some public schools. If you look at the buildings and look at the structure and provide other programs in there, it activates it. It creates an opportunity for not only children but also adults. Equally so, we combine that or hybridize that with open public space where artists can be involved. They can show their art. Most of the studies we've done in Detroit have primarily been, the seed has already been planted by the artist. And from that standpoint, we think from doing these master plans for the city are the key parts in which you engage. Find that art, find that inspiration, find that seed, and build upon it. So we do these drawings, work with the city, and then they throw out these RFQs, requests for qualifications, and developers come in and they do it. And the RFQs we do, they show these images to potential developers to say, this is what you can do. So it's very exciting for us to deal at this scale, not only the scale of buildings, but the scale of larger plans. Just to jump cut to our work in Los Angeles, this represents a quick overview of the projects we're doing in Los Angeles right now. We always felt that if you embrace the kind of challenging existing conditions of the city, and you see that each one of these interventions in the city can have an impact. There's an idea of it can act as a catalyst, and you start to produce these projects, and you bring architecture, and you bring social civic connectivity. If you bring these ideas, you start to engage the ecological and infrastructural patterns of the area, you deal with culture of the environment and where it is, and you start to see that it can act as a catalyst. Now, I've always held the position that there are many other architects like myself who also want to bring the same ideas. So you take all these dots, and you multiply that by 10 other architects or developers doing the same amount of work, you can see the impact you can have in the city. So Los Angeles is going through a very interesting period now where architecture and ideas similar to what I'm pursuing is being done in the city, and that's something that we're very excited about. So the first project I'm going to talk about, I'm going to just talk about 4 projects and then 2 or 3 master plans that we're doing. This is a project in West Hollywood. It's located at a corner of Santa Monica Boulevard and Formosa Avenue in West Hollywood. The project was very interesting because it was the first opportunity of looking at an unorthodox public-private partnership with the city of West Hollywood, which is a very progressive city. What happened with this project was, you can see the density of the city. That's our site where you can see the red dot. So very dense. Los Angeles is one of the most dense cities in the country. And it's horizontal, but it's very dense. And so most of the work there, it tends to be urban infill projects. With that context, we tackled this project in an unusual way. On the actual location or the site was this existing house. The city approached us and said, look, you have to keep that house. We're getting a lot of pushback from neighborhoods. They don't want you to tear down every house and build housing projects. We looked at this house and said there's very little architectural significance to this project. So we said, okay, how can we come back to the city and say, look, it doesn't benefit the city. It's a crack house. It's not a very good location. Neighbors don't want it, but the city wanted us to keep it. So we became strategists, and we said, okay, what can we do to come back to the city and propose an alternative strategy that will agree, so they'll agree for us to take to remove the house. Well, that approach was this idea of amplified, kind of in a way, modified courtyard housing. On the top left, you can see a conventional courtyard housing typology. You have the introverted open space. It's available as a common open space for the people in the building, but it does not engage the street or the sidewalk. You can see ultimately how that party leads to the courtyard housing block infill, which is in the bottom left. So that's the principal way that courtyard housing became celebrated in Los Angeles. Our argument is, can we do a modified courtyard housing and create an extroverted open space? And that's what you see on the far right, on the top right. If you can actually position the argument to the city and says, we will give you a pocket park, a public park and private land, if you allow us to remove this house. They were thrilled because West Hollywood has 1% of green space, and they're looking for these opportunities to create green space. So ultimately, our goal is, if you look at the bottom right image, it talks about how you have a modified courtyard housing. You can imagine that if our building pushes it to the edge and creates this pocket park, each other site next to us and behind us could do the same thing. You then might have an 80-foot swath by 300-foot green space, which suggests a different way of experiencing the city. It also means you can walk to a park. Most green space in Los Angeles, you get in your car. You go to Griffith Park, you go to the beach, you go to the mountains. You can't walk. So the idea is, can you change that by creating these pocket parks throughout the city? That was our goal. Ultimately, we tackled that idea. Another issue which is quite important to me was the idea of context. And I don't know if about Los Angeles, but context is always kind of it's a strange word because there isn't much context in Los Angeles in one way, but there is in another way. We feel that our context for our building was this cafe, a very renowned cafe called Formosa, and it has a personal connection to me, or a sentimental reason. My dad, who was a film actor, used to frequent this restaurant with Orson Welles and John Houseman. He was there in the early Mercury Theater. It was a great time in Hollywood, and this cafe is where all these actors would go and brainstorm and chat about what they were doing. So when I got this commission, I used that cafe as my context, my cultural connection to the area, and the context was color, as unusual as it sounds. So that was what drove this project. I'd also mentioned this intriguing idea. How do you create a pocket park, a public space on private land? And also, how do you deal with parking? So our argument was you can tuck the parking for the private building, which you can see on the right-hand side, and then have the park above it. So you can accomplish it. You just have this hybrid program of public over private space, because frankly, the parking is private. It's for the building. The park is for public. And so we approached the city, they loved the idea, and then we had to negotiate with them as to who's responsible. If you have a public park and private land, and the private land is owned by the building owners, but the park is run by the city, what happens if someone breaks their leg, or God forbid, something happens and someone dies? Who's responsible? Well, ultimately, the city agreed to take the responsibility. And so that was something we ended up doing. So here is the architect as a strategist, an architect who's coming up with ideas that are rethinking the convention. There are very few public parks and private land in Los Angeles. It's a very privatized city, and people with their own land, they want it for themselves. They don't want to give it to the city. So this was an interesting way where it was a win-win situation with the city, a win-win situation with the client. He was able to build his 11 units, and from an architectural standpoint, it was fascinating to be more of a strategist and not simply an architect. And that's just a view of the project right there. So you can see that we parceled a third of the building for the Pocket Park, which is for the surrounding community. And this is someone two people walking in it. So this benefits the tenants who live on the property, but as well, because what they get to look out on is a small pocket park as opposed to a building 5 feet away. So that's the intriguing concept. How can you as an architect create these opportunities that have a social civic connectivity? How can you embrace the idea of aesthetics? How can you look at context and culture in a different way? And ultimately, this was the solution. There was a little bit of pushback early on. People were arguing the case. Do people really want to live in a red building? I can assure you they do. This sold very quickly. And it became more of an iconic building in West Hollywood right now because there are not very many buildings. Not only this color, but also working with the nature of mantle exterior. So this was a very exciting project for us. And there's a view from the building next to it, which also looks at a park. So you imagine the nature of urban infill. If you provide these 40 by 100 foot green spaces, it benefits not only your building, benefits the building next to it as well, and eventually the buildings on the backside. So it's a very interesting concept. We managed to get the 11 units. The city allowed the developer to flush out the street level. These type of 4-story buildings, you're supposed to step back 10 feet at 18 feet. So he was able to get one more unit by flushing it out on the exterior. So the return was the city got a park, the developer was to get one extra unit. And it's a really interesting concept for an architect or the role changing. Can you do work that's of consequence? Can you play the role of an architect as a strategist and be part of that process? It's been very exciting for us to do this. Ultimately, this is what you could end up with. If the city was rethought and if as developers were looking at the sites, if you could imagine, if you have to pencil out with parking, if you can hybridizing the idea of social civic connectivity, if you can hybridize the unit counts you have and you can work with parking strategically, you could eventually create a much better city. And this is what we think down the road could conceivably happen. Of course, it's abstract. It may not be these formal geometries I have here, but the principled idea is, can you create different ways of addressing the formidable urban grid of a city? Is there ways to look at it in a different way? Can you create strange loops? Can you create density and green space at the same time? This is our belief that you can. It's not one versus the other. You can hybridize it if you look ways of being creative with the city, in addition to working with very talented developers. The next project is for a developer, a colleague of mine named Jason Reynolds, who is a Dallas developer. And Jason hired us in Los Angeles. It's Phoenix Property Partners, I believe is the name of the firm. So Jason approached us after 3 years working on this project in Westwood. It was to be student housing for UCLA. So for 3 years, they were stuck in the architectural review board process and the planning. They kept rejecting the previous solution because one of the key issues of the site, and you can see here in a very abstract way, it's a wedge-shaped geometry. That's the site. And what was most interesting was that there is a historical landmark house by Richard Neutra, which is called the Strathmore Apartments, right next to it. And the previous solution that was proposed here was a 6-story continuous building. And what happened was the Friends of Strathmore Apartments the community activists fought against the building because they didn't want to walk out their 2-story structure and look at a 6-story structure. So what Jason did was he tried 2 or 3 years to get through the previous solution, and to his credit, he cut his losses, interviewed a number of other architects, and ended up selecting us and said, look, can you solve this problem? How do we get approval through our ARB and through planning and solve what we need, which is 150 student beds? So our solution in doing that was, here's another shot of the site. It drops from 50 feet coincidentally from one end to the other. That's the site, and you can see on the right-hand side is the Neutra building, and there it is right there. So this is one of Richard Neutra's multifamily projects he did. He was certainly known and celebrated for his houses, but he also was very involved with the larger scale housing projects. And this was a step massing up a hill, 2-story volumes, and that was the driving force in terms of the massing of what we did. So here you are engaging, learning from adjacencies, but really honoring this adjacency. If a building that you're building next to it is good, you could absolutely embrace it and understand what it's trying to do and and build a project that engages it and is honoring that building. So we did with this project, absolutely. This one wasn't about color. This is about the massing of the Neutra project. So that shows you the site. That's our building. You can see the Strathmore Apartments. So our argument was, okay, our building, when you leave the Strathmore Apartments and look across Strathmore Drive, we have to look at the massing of that building at that particular location and really address the issue of a scale. So there you can see the smaller massing was the building. You can see the lower part of the building was next to the Strathmore Apartments. So we developed a scheme that responded to these considerations of the neighborhood. And the client success, we had to deal with extensive program of the client. That never changed. The massing changed, but not the program. We solved the problem. And there's another early massing study of the project. There's a model looking at the two massing. We also slipped the building, as opposed to one large building, we slipped it into two buildings, and two wedge-shaped buildings slip past each other, so you have access from exterior for the units. And that's our building. Now, what's intriguing about it is you can see the Strathmore Apartments on the right-hand side. We were able to solve this problem. The reason the previous architect was not able to was there was a requirement of a 50-foot view corridor in the middle of the building. So if you can imagine the middle of this building, you had a large cut that was 50 feet, 4-story, that was also 50 feet deep, you're losing over 15 units or 20 units. So what we accomplished was we went to the city and the planning and said, okay, you need a 50-foot corridor. Does it all have to be in one location? And coincidentally, if you reinterpret the code, you can have your 50-foot view corridor, but you can split it into number areas. So as you can see, we've managed to put a view corridor right in the corner edge of Strathmore and Levering. You can see there's an open space, and you can see on the far end of the building you have another cut. So this was interpreting the code. So when we did this, they said, yes, you can do that. So the previous team had not asked the question. So that's also an interesting approach. Can you challenge the zoning? Can you challenge planners? Can you reinterpret what they're saying? And this was a perfect example of how we did that. Needless to say, we did pass 7-0, the Architecture Review Board, and we built it within 14 or 15 months. So overall, it was a very successful project for the client. In addition, for the city was very happy with it as well. So that's one view of it. This idea of step massing became activated spaces, outdoor study areas for the students. So each level had places where people would come and sit out and hang out and learn and share ideas. All those issues, very critical, very important, creating these opportunities for people to socialize, to study, and share ideas. And this is extraordinarily important for this area, Westwood, where they are desperately needing housing for students. And there's another image of it. That's the view from Strathmore Apartments. As you can see, this massing starts as a 1-story to a 2-story. That's right across the street. And then we push the density to the other end, where the buildings are 5 to 6-story on the other end. All this came from a reinterpretation of the zoning. And if you read it direct, it looks like you have to cut a large void right down the middle. We felt you could reinterpret it. And that's just a view also of where the parking is and the building above. Material-wise, we worked with an off-the-shelf material, a metal, corrugated metal with a more custom profile. Because of the actual scope and we were able to have the company, Metal Sales, to create a profile that we wanted. We were also able to look at different patterning per level. So each level has a different pattern to the metal. What's nice is when the sun hits it, which certainly that you can't see here, but when the sun hits it, it has multiple shades and shadows on it. So it's an interesting way of working with white. White has the colors of everything, the spectrum color of everything, depending on what you're reflecting and how you work with the sun. So it's a very interesting materiality, metal, and also the color, which played a big role. All of our cuts into the building, we always think of the argument of an apple. When you cut into an apple, you can change the color or change the materiality. So we tend to do that. That breaks the massing down. And this one was cement board. So these cuts are cement board, which we painted 6 hues of green. This was the strategy we used on this project. And that's just another view of it as well. So all the vertical spaces were activated. So this wasn't about activating the ground plane. It was activating the building itself sectionally in a vertical way. A different way of looking at it. The students do like the building. They like to go outside and study as well. And that's just a detail showing the different materials. And now if one was to ask me, does corrugated metal, isn't that for warehouses? No, it's for everything. It's how you take something that's ordinary and trying to make it unique or a little bit more extraordinary. It's just how you approach it. And that really drives our work as well. We do like this idea of materiality and how you make that something unique. And this shows an example of that. The next project is a project in Koreatown. And by the way, in our office, we work with drawings. We do abstract drawings like this. It's an interesting approach that normally drawings are a means to an end. You draw architectural drawings to produce buildings. We think that process can also include drawings like this. It's an opportunity to maybe discover ideas with it, but it's also, in a sense, a piece of the process, but it's equally so an end in itself. You can do a drawing that has this quality, and part of my background is in between working at I.M. Pei's on the Louvre and working at Stephen Hall's, I became an artist and I wanted to be a painter, and I said I was done with architecture. So I couldn't make it financially, full disclosure. I couldn't get a gallery show, so I ran out of money. But those 2 years I lived in New York, I was determined to be a painter. And I felt like, well, maybe I'll bring that artistry perhaps to the buildings that I'm doing. So we tried to look at drawings in a very unique way. We try to look at buildings in a unique way, and that's what I do now. So architecture is certainly a critical component of that process. This building is in Koreatown. It's a neighborhood that's really fascinating. It's really at the forefront of changing modes of contemporary living. All these units are flexible spaces. You can have 3 individuals living there. You can have families. You can have couples with individuals. So we designed it in such a way internally that you can be flexible with all the different spaces. So that's perhaps co-living is another project we're doing in Detroit. I'll show you that next. We think that there's a way of rethinking how housing should be. There's the typical LA density that you see. You can see where the site is. Again, urban infill in an area that's it's certainly not gentrified. So the target audience of this housing project was students and also primarily young professionals making $40,000, $50,000 a year. They're out of school and they're applying their trades. They don't have the resources to spend $2,000 or $3,000 a month. So we managed to find a way to produce an architecture to be able to house young people. And that's a view right there of our building in the context of the city of Los Angeles. And that's the site you can see on the right-hand side. Again, you could look at the neighborhood, the community. It's not an area where there's a lot of money. So we had to design this project for $170 per square foot, which we did. And there it is. And it's become a very important building in Koreatown. It's something where people really want to live there. It's a very interesting mix of people. The roof is very activated, so that's an outdoor space where people use all the time. This one was also the diagram and the partie we did with the 32 units. This is what we ended up doing. A very simple, but in a way we think a provocative idea. If you look at the first image, it's just a typical square with windows with a cutout for a courtyard. Can you conceivably push in the middle of each 4 sides, being very democratic in doing it, and simply this radius curve on the surface? You can do it if it's metal studs or wood studs. It's not that more complicated to create a very simple radius or a concave or convex form. It's not that complicated. We pitched the idea, the client and the contractor said there's no additional cost. We just have to be a little bit more careful, and we have to lay out the studs to create this very slight curve. The benefit of it was we built it very efficiently, which freed up some resources to be able to provide the exterior, which, as you can see here, each balcony and each window had sunshade and conceivably outdoor spaces. So they grabbed back that equity by virtue of the balconies. So there was this idea, this is a way of reinterpreting how we do these projects. A very limited budget, as opposed to just the box, you do these simple moves. You can certainly see on the roof line, there's a very subtle curve to it. When you're there, you read it very clearly. It also created this interesting opportunity where these shading devices in the middle of the building were deeper, and the ones on the edges were much thinner. So there's that, again, this shift, this idea of a subtle idea, but you can actually create a more provocative facade for it. And there you can see the protruded balconies on either side. So again, you say, this is a facade, this is a building. You can do this. It's got opportunities to look at different ways of addressing this idea of layers and the idea of buildings. There doesn't have to be flatness. You could have this layered effect to it. We worked with color, of course, white and black, so there was a balance between colors, but that was a compositional thing. But again, patterning is important. The idea of materiality is important. Building efficient buildings is important. We also looked at the plaster or stucco, and we have this kind of grading on the stucco, as you can see. So there's a screed, so we didn't make it a flat, a steel troweled exterior. We had this roughness to it, which is quite interesting. Courtyard, we also looked at internally. So the courtyard is carved in the center, which is in a way juxtaposing the exterior. The exterior was a concave and this was convex. So the idea was, can you create outdoor spaces in the central courtyard that brings in natural light and has exterior access for all the people living in the building. So there's a view, the built view of it. So we worked, we again challenged the handle, with the guardrail. We thought, well, yes, it could be solid, but can you look at it, and just with plaster, can you look with a geometry, a formal geometry to it that creates some inventiveness to the courtyard. So that's what we did in the courtyard. And that's the view on the roof. I would say 95% of the buildings surrounding this building do not activate their roof. To me, it's the fifth elevation. It's something that's quite interesting. You can have wonderful opportunities to do stuff up there, but also views is great. The actual cost of it turning it into a deck or a roof deck is negligible. It's just something people don't do. So we tend to do with all of our projects having roof decks. It's a way of creating outdoor spaces, a common open space. It's ways of creating private open spaces. So it's kind of an added asset to think of it as the fifth elevation. The other thing, and just in closing on this project, is we feel it's very democratic. It's done with a very tight budget, but all four elevations have the same balance of architecture and artistry to it, so you don't feel like whichever unit you have, that there's, you have to choose, or you have the lesser of the units. So as you go through the building, each unit is equally important. And that's also often important, because sometimes buildings have a front, and then you kind of loosen or you reduce the value of the others, but we think all four are equally important. The view on the right shows how we split the units, so you can actually have a number of accesses from a hallway to entry, so there's privacy, but at the same time could be a balance. If you have a bedroom, one unit, you have a hallway leading to another unit, you have privacy. So it's a very unique way of looking at it. So we have the closets and the cabinets are separating these flexible spaces. And that's just the entry. Again, very small move, but it worked. The next project is a project for previously homeless veterans and chronically homeless individuals. It's in South Los Angeles. It's close to LA Coliseum, and it will soon to be, it was close to the home of the '84 Olympics, and soon possibly to the 2028 Olympics, apparently. We've got it. That's what I hear. So it's a very interesting area where it's not only got these very larger, important places, but equally so, with this part of the city, a number of civic and cultural institutions exist. It is also one of the most underserved parts of the city, with a poverty rate of over 33%, and a college graduation rate of over just over 4%. So this area in South Los Angeles will continue and does continue to be a challenging area. There's an enormous amount of poverty. This project is essential in these areas. As you may have heard, there were over 58,000 homeless individuals in Los Angeles, and it's growing over 20% each year. So really important for LA to tackle this issue. They just recently provided a new incentive. They have a new proposition that they passed where they will provide $3.5 billion for rent subsidies and supportive services over the next decade. So that was just passed in Los Angeles. So everyone's paying a little bit more taxes, but they're going to use that money to finally tackle this issue, which is critical. It's a very wealthy city, but you have very rich and very poor. And it is a very big issue. and people are gravitating to Los Angeles. And people on the streets, there are families, there's kids, there are people who lost their job. It's not everyone who just has a drug issue or an alcoholic issue. There are multiple type of people on the streets. So it's something that we have to tackle, and we're involved with 4 different projects of supportive housing, trying to be involved with all that in a very important way. That's the site. Great context of McDonald's. Great architecture. This one I really wanted to push. I'm only kidding. But it's it's a typical LA scene where you have a McDonald's and you have housing. And so the infill project is between those two. Our idea for this homeless housing project was identical to our other strategies. It was carving out a strategic void, became an outdoor space, push the buildings around it, and also create on the street retail. It's very important to hybridize and create mixed-use type projects like this because it's revenue generating. So on the street level, this project, we will have retail. They will sell things. And it's something that's very helpful because it helps with social services for the homeless. So this is a very interesting thing that's happening quite a bit in Los Angeles, where it's not just homeless housing with social services, but we think that on the street, you need to activate it. You need to create opportunities for retail as well. So these are just a series of parties we did. The volume that's floating is on the street level is a retail space. Above it is a community space. And that's an axonometric of the project. It's over 30 units of different sizes. Some are for family. If there's a homeless veteran who has a family and he's pulled away from the family, it's an opportunity to bring them all back together, and also individuals. So it's a mix of a number of type of potential renters. And there's a view from the street. So you got the retail at the bottom, carved out another opening, activated the street. We also have another strategic void in the middle that it connects to the podium. Now, these type of projects, you can't afford to do subterranean parking, so you have to bring the parking above, and that's why there's a podium at the first level. There's parking tucked underneath it. So this is how we managed to do it, where the parking doesn't drive the solution. It's buried, it's hidden, but also you really have this sense of connection to the sidewalk and street. So that stairwell ultimately will be used for people to we didn't put the fence there, we pushed it at the top. So you can imagine people sitting there and hanging out and talking. So this idea of really engaging the city is extremely important, not only for homeless projects, but also market rate projects. And that's just a shot where we'll be finished probably June, July, sometime in that time. So that's a view of the building from the street, and just some more details of the corner edges, and also the courtyard. Again, it's a homeless housing project, but the value of the design, there's not a great difference between the Mariposa project or the Formosa for that matter. It's all the same ideas. Economically, they're the same range of cost, and we think that there needs to be this. It's critical to make sure that architecture is for everybody, all across through all socioeconomic levels. Just another view. That's the green wall or green roof that falls down to the street. So the roof of the retail will be a green roof, so it's great for thermal mass. It's good to also bring some green space into the city as well. This area is lacking in that way. So we thought perhaps we can bring the green down to the street and then tuck the retail underneath it. And that's above where you have the community space. The next project is also fascinating. The housing crisis in LA has created an immediate need for the city to figure out a way to house 50,000 homeless. So the city has developed a new program where they have identified and released over 1,700 city-owned properties for affordable housing developers. Now, the sites are challenging. There are areas that are leftover space. Land is at a premium in Los Angeles. The only area you really can find are areas next to freeways, or areas where, like this one, which is right next to the largest freeway interchange, coincidentally, in the world. It's the 110 and 105 freeway, and that's the site. So this whole program they have with the city now is trying to find developers willing to buy these properties that will provide housing. All those issues are critical. It is a challenging site. How do you create housing right next to a freeway when you think of air pollution, among all the challenges you have? So we took on this challenge when we were approached by the client and said, we'll help you work to figure this out. The other issue was these take 3.5 years from inception to completion. The process of getting 14 or 15 sources for funding. It takes forever to get tax credits. If you don't get it 1 year, you wait a year to get the tax credits the next year. So all these things became a critical issue of the project. So we, as strategists on this, thought, okay, we're going to figure this out. The first thing we looked at was, okay, how are we going to deal with this very complex site, which is not exactly the most ideal spot. We looked at it, we decided that, okay, the first thing we're going to do is compress the time it takes, because if the client buys the land, he doesn't want to carry the land for 3-4 years. So we did propose an idea, which is we've been developing, which is factory containers. So there are containers we're going to be working with. So we've done our research, and this is the critical issue about working with containers. You do certainly have the typical design and approval process, but can you take the 3.5 years and the whole process, and not only construction? Normally construction takes 18 to 20 months to do these projects, just because of the nature of prevailing wages and the process of building in Los Angeles. So if you have a factory fabrication and you're fabricating the containers, which they have the drawings to do what they need to, can we also do grading, preparation, and foundations at the same time? So you have that hybridized time, then you ship it, and your installation for these projects is very, very minimal, because it's all built and you're stacking it. So you compress the installation. So if you can imagine, you have maybe 7 months for factory fabrication, grading, and preparation at the same time. You have 1 month to ship it. You have 3 days. That might be a little bit optimistic. What's that word? Ruthless optimism? Yeah. Okay, so let's say it takes 2 weeks. Then you install it, and then you have 2 to 3 months and 2 to 3 months to landscape. But you compress that, you're talking about 7, 9, 11, 14, forgive me, the 7 months is happening at the same time of grading. So you're going to compress and save at least a year in doing this process. Instead of waiting and having done the grading and preparation, the foundations, which will take 6 months, 7 months, and then you build it, you're hybridizing the two. So you're saving that 7 months to start with. The idea installation of containers is only 3 to 5 days. So we're saving, ultimately, the client felt, at least a year in this process. So that was what drove the project. So they bought the idea, the city bought the idea of containers. They thought it was an intriguing idea. The other thing we had to look at was this issue of how do you deal with air pollution. So they vacated this Athens Way. It was an alley. So that alley became a screening, a veil, a landscape buffer to be able to create landscaping. So as the toxic air from the freeways, or the challenging air for that matter, we can use landscape to create a filter. So in a way, thinking of the building more as a way of breathing lung, but also trying to protect the building from those issues. So the city vacated this alley to give us this opportunity. How do you create permeable surface? How do you grow trees there? All those aspects played a role in this. So we do have that going on with this project. We also looked at this issue of water, which is equally as important to us. So we are going to work with this idea of rainwater collection, very important in Los Angeles. So here we are doing homeless housing, looking at rainwater collection, and we're looking at solar panels. So here we are hybridizing infrastructure and housing and providing solutions for the homeless. So this is the way that we think architecture can play a bigger role in the city. And this project is in the early stages. We're going to start DD, design development, pretty soon. Now I'm going to just show the next 2 or 3 projects. They're master plans in a building we're doing. This one is in Detroit. I want to talk briefly about the experience we've had in Detroit. As you know, Detroit and LA are vastly different landscapes and conditions. We always think of Los Angeles as places where you create these projects that are essentially in dense urban infill lots. That's the nature of the city. It's already built out. You have these opportunities to infill lots. In Detroit, it is very different. We're faced with a very unique scenario of inverted figure-ground relationship of dramatically underdeveloped neighborhood fabric. We have burned out houses that have been cleared out. We have fields everywhere. So how do you design in a city where half the city is not there? And that's the challenge that we've been having with our projects. But we're learning from it in Detroit and trying to look to the future with our projects. How do we create buildings that could act as a catalyst that will help and encourage more development in the future? So that was a role that we played. The other thing I learned from working in Detroit, which has been very interesting, is they're very much interested about social priorities and working with neighborhood groups. All of our projects in the neighborhoods in Detroit, as I mentioned, it's something that's very unique. In the previous kind of periods of Detroit, all the work was done in downtown Detroit, and that their hope was there would be trickle-down effect into the neighborhoods. It didn't happen. It never has happened. Now we're Maurice Cox and his planners are now developing and building and producing work in the neighborhoods for people who are in the neighborhoods, not getting rid of them, but actually for them. So it's a public-private partnership that's going on with the city of Detroit and multiple developers and multiple architects to try to find solutions that can be for the people who are there. And the city is saying, look, if you build this, we will sell the land at a quarter of the price because the city owns it. They either continue holding it or they can sell it. And that's what's very fascinating about it. The city is working with these developers in a very unique public-private partnership. These are all the projects we're doing in Detroit right now. And they're all on the edges or the perimeters of downtown or some very far. We've done two larger studies for the city. Next week I'm going to present again for this place called Russell Woods and Arden Park, two neighborhoods. One is very distressed, the other one is a little bit better. So we're also tackling large ideas in Detroit. This project is called Baltimore Station. It's with the developer named The Platform. It's a very interesting client. You can see the relationship of the site to downtown. It's right next to the Amtrak, and it's also right next to the new M1 rail as well that takes you right down to downtown Detroit. So the site was right next to all public transit. That's the first thing that's critical because people don't have the resources always to drive places. It's right next to in a kind of confluence of Wayne State University. There's Motown. There's a lower density of residential area and an area called News Center. Equally so, there's a very strong, fascinating historical industrial area, of which it also houses the Ford Piquet plant where they built all the Model T Fords. There's the site. Again, it's nothing strong, but nothing provocative, but a site that is going to house co-living for the neighborhoods. It's right next to the light rail. That's the context. They've got these amazing projects. The one on the left is where all the Model T Fords were built. This is a block away from our site. You have the Fisher Building, and you also have Motown. So very fascinating history to Detroit. And this represents our study of what we did on the project. And this one is also very fascinating because it talks about how do you create an incubator as a building? How do you create an architecture or a building that will embrace Wayne State University? The co-living component of the building, which is a third of the units, is essentially just a sleeping room, and you share a living, dining, kitchen. It's an area that works for students. The chancellor of Wayne State University was excited about it because he felt that students, when they leave school, they go to their apartment and they close the door. There's no engagement. So the idea to create co-living where they would have to then walk out of the room, share a kitchen or a living room area is very important. That was what drove this idea of co-living, and we collaborated with Wayne State University on that. Equally so, we're also looking at the young professionals who live downtown. They might make $30,000, $40,000, so how do you create housing for them? So the idea of creating units where you share kitchens and you have your own sleeping quarters with your small bathroom, but you share kitchen, living, dining, was very important. It meant that the client can also not build kitchens for 150 units, but can build 50 kitchens that can accommodate 10 people. So they saved because they saved the cost of 10 kitchens. They saved the cost of having 10 living rooms and dining rooms. So all that started to play in a role. So we were able to, given that the rents were going to be very low in this building, they were able to save $2 to $3 million on the cost of the building. So our cost in building this project is $150 per square foot. That shows a section through the building, and that is the co-living area in the middle. So all these units that surround the kind of common open space engage, and they use this outdoor space as the common space to share. We also, which was really exciting, was this is a detailer project that we're using sheet metal panels for the exterior envelope, and we are utilizing the metal stamping process used to manufacture car parts, car body parts. So there's another cultural, contextual link to Detroit. This is a company we're working with who's going to work on the facade of the building, but a company that normally does metal stamping process for the assembly line. So why can't you jump cross boundaries? Why can't you work with companies that build shells of cars? And what's nice is the result is this panelized facade, which is highly unique. And yet it's a co-living project. It's being built for $150. But these people had no issues building these things. They do it all the time. In fact, they saw it as one of the easiest things they had to do. How can they create formwork to create the patterning of the 2 metal panel modules? So in this project, we worked with these 2 metal modules, but depending on how you lay it out, you have this result. So this is a building that, to me, it looks like a curtain. So it's a unique thing. It's a metal curtain, but it has this opportunity to rethinking the idea of layers and the facade of the flatness of buildings. We start to create depth. And there's the project. So we're under construction on this right now, so this is very exciting. Hybrid programs, it's art related, it's co-living, it's got all the different essential things you want for a very strong, dynamic, very important project in Detroit. The final 2 projects I'm showing are what we've now doing next. So what we are doing next is jumping scale. We've been commissioned by not only North Carolina and Florida, West Palm Beach, to look at larger projects and finding ways to activate it. This project is in West Palm Beach, and it's the area which is industrial. It's not Palm Beach, but it's next to it. It's an area where it's an emerging kind of area. It's an industrial area. It's not as gentrified as Palm Beach, but it's got some emphasis. It's some essential things about that needs social and civic connectivity. Right now it's an industrial area. So this project is going to be hybridized. It's going to have multiple programs. It's a way of creating what you need to make a city work. So there's lots of public and private space in this project. You can see the site. It's another wedge shape. For some reason, I get lots of wedge shape sites, which works for me. There was a few of it. You can see the site. As you can see also, there's a number of industrial buildings adjacent, both sides. And there's a view. You can see it's another area that is not necessarily an ideal place to think about having housing, but this one's important. It's a very interesting area where all these warehouses and industrial areas are starting to change. They're starting to become more activated. They've got, I think there's a number of what's it called, with the gym. Yes, that one. They've got all these programs that come into the area. So we will look to the context and recognize that the residential area is much lower. It's 1 story. And certainly the warehouse spaces are also 1 story, not big. So we came up with a Part T for the building, which is about 170 units, pushing down in 2 corners that engage and have relationship to the smaller adjacent buildings, and push the density again, which is what we did in Westwood. But the ideas of amplified urbanism were applied to here as well. So this is a project we're now in design development. Coincidentally, this project, the client was someone who saw our work and said, can we apply some of the ideas you're doing in Los Angeles here in West Palm Beach? So I flew out there, met with them, brainstormed, and this was the Part T we came up with that we're working on right now. There's a section through it. Based on the budget, we had to have above grade parking. They couldn't afford to dig down for subterranean. So we are convinced that over time, parking structures and the need to park is going to go away. People are going to do public transit, they're going to ride bikes, they're going to walk. So we designed the parking where over time we can carve out light wells to bring in light from the central area, which is open, to bring light down there and conceivably change the program. It could be a gym, it could be some other amenities. So we think these parking structures, it's very important to think about everything you do is have flexibility and see how it could change. When you think about all the buildings that are built and all the parking that's designed for those buildings, think about it from a developer standpoint. What if all that was revenue generating and not just parking as required by the city? So you can comply with the city requirements, but over time, perhaps 20, 30 years from now, that's going to go. And it'd be interesting to think of parking as something that you can, as if you're investing in these buildings, can you create spaces that are accommodating parking now as per requirements, but 20 years from now they become less required, the requirements are reduced significantly. Can you reformulate that space? And that's what the idea is, this project. And there's a view of it right there. So again, our client also works with concrete. So this is a concrete building. It's essentially a moment frame of concrete. And you can see that all the units are stitched into or placed, embed in this grid structure. We also opened the edges and activated the edges for an open space on this corner. Part of the reason we did that is that it connects to the next door neighbor, which has this paseo that comes through it. So this is a way of connecting, again, adjacencies and see how what you're doing has a relationship with what's next to it, continuing this idea of making cities work better. And that's just a detail of the facade. We're looking at ways of materiality and lightness, but architecturally, this is more rational, but you can also bring aesthetics and bring ideas to it where there's this starts to work. And all the roofs conceivably could be used. We're being more strategic about how many roof decks we have on this from a cost standpoint. It is an area that doesn't have an enormous amount of money. But again, we're doing this for a very limited budget. And that's another view where we push the density to the corners, which made sense in that area. But you can see in this particular area, the residential area is on the left-hand side. So we took the massing and stepped it down to the residential area, and the density there is next to the commercial buildings or the warehouses. The last project, we're nearly there, thank you for hanging in there, is a project that we were commissioned in Raleigh, North Carolina. And this project was, in a place called South Saunders. It includes a master plan and 12 buildings of multiple scales. And this was a very exciting project where we're not only doing the master plan, but we're also, we'll be doing the project. And that's the site study we did. It took over 3 months of working with the mayor of Raleigh and all the planners and our clients. Made it very much a pedestrian relationship to the site. We tucked the parking and the driveway over in the, it's hard to see, but it's on the north, it's the west side. So that's 50 foot higher than the other end. So we tucked the parking underneath the higher area. But we also created a really strong pedestrian relationship, not only to the creek, that's an existing creek that's on the site. So we engaged that by virtue of the buildings, and then we stepped back in terms of the height. So the section, the first step is a hybrid between residential, work, and play. So this was an idea of looking at all three kind of key areas, which is can you create an area that has everything you would need? Can you have a place where you can work, live, and also hang out and have opportunities for entertainment? And that's just a quick kind of a conceptual study of it. You have vertical buildings, that in between you have areas for pedestrians. You activate it with offices and live work. You have dining, retail. So edges are programmed in a certain way. And then you go vertical where you have the housing. But also provide opportunities for bikes and pedestrians in addition to vehicles. And that's a view from the Dorothy Dix Park, which has been designed by Michael van Valkenburg. He's a landscape architect. He's doing this enormous park. So we're extending the park. We're right now at the Dorothy Dix looking at our site, and we're extending the bandwidth of the park into our site. So we repositioned our buildings to allow for that. And this whole project was intriguing because if you can start early like this in terms of master planning and zoning, you know that you have a better opportunity when you finally get around to building the buildings, because sometimes architects are given a master plan and say, here's what we've been approved, and you have to work with it. But if you can get involved early from a design standpoint and provide opportunities like this, it makes a lot more sense. So when you get to the next stage, when you're starting to build it during the phases, you're in a much stronger place to start with. You've got something that's very activated, you've got an area that is connected from a social standpoint, and you want people to come here as a destination. And that's extremely important. So for us, it's very exciting to be part of this process as well, which we're doing now in Detroit and West Palm Beach and in Raleigh in Florida. Raleigh, North Carolina. There's another view of the creek and our early studies and our presentation to the mayor of Raleigh. This is what we presented, how we're thinking of how we can activate the retail area. And this is another view from the major streets. So this is a gateway to Raleigh. You can see that the buildings we're designing are right now conceptual, but we're also thinking about these buildings as being somewhat unique. Right now they're ghosted out, white buildings, but one can imagine formally that each one could be different. Part of the problem with these type of master plans, that all the verticals look exactly the same. But if you think early about this and you think about, well, this is an opportunity for this type of building here, here's another one. We have the vertical ones are positioned strategically to have views of Raleigh. And that's a way of looking at activating the ground plane, activating the retail area, and have the towers. Each one, if you look back to the plan, it's designed in such a way that view quarters towards the downtown Raleigh are there. So that's why the geometry of the buildings are shifting. It's providing that the building behind it has a view quarter to downtown Raleigh. So it allowed an opportunity to do better architecture, but also formally made it more interesting. So that's the way you take advantage of constraints and parameters. So I just want to say, we do believe that as an architect, we can be equally part of the conversation, and that's what interests me. Sometimes we're at the end of the game. Everyone's worked it out. The city is zoned certain ways. You've got developers that come in with their numbers, and it has to pencil out. If the architects are involved early, they can play a role. They can have a voice. And it is a conversation. It's a dialogue, and we push for that. So when clients come to us, and they're saying, well, we're working with the city on these issues, well, can we join you for that conversation? And the city likes it because we might come up with alternative strategies that works. And right now I'm on a think tank for, it's a pilot program with a number of those 1,700 lots that are really challenging next to freeways and other very complex sites. And we're part of that conversation with the mayor's team and also with the city controllers who own the land. And it's very interesting to do that. It's something that drives my work. It's something that's exciting to me. So that is the key issue. Architect is a strategist. It's not simply someone who produces a product based on giving the opportunity to design a building. We think that it should go further than that. And I have to say, all the projects are different scales, but they do present our commitment to shaping architectural impact on social conditions and through our work. There is a way. You have to hybridize it. You have to have aesthetics, political, social, smart thinking, and smart design to be able to produce all this work. And we feel that that's essential. We look at housing, how housing impacts communities socially. We think that it's critical to have it civically connected, and we think aesthetically it has to connect. All these projects are important for the fabric of city. And just in closing, it's not just me. We have a relatively smallish to mid-sized firm, and trust me, I'm not doing all of it. We've got a great team from people all over the place, including students from Texas Tech. Not students, forgive me, young architects. So we have students from the East Coast, from Dallas, we have areas from Chicago, from Los Angeles, and it's a great group, and I'm proud to say that they like what we do. I'm the old person, you can see me there in the front. But they're all pretty exciting. We have a young firm, and people get shocked when they walk in and say, all these young people are producing this? And you'd be surprised. If you're committed to what you're doing and you love what you're doing, you can accomplish a lot. So thank you very much.